Well, hello and welcome to the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder, executive director, and the host of the podcast. I do a lot of things around here. I'm really excited to have you here with us. It is Thursday, August 28th, and it is 3:30 here in the East Coast of the United States. I'm excited to have our guest with us today, who you're going to get to meet here in a second. We've got Alex Venet joining us. But before we get to our guest, a little bit about who we are and what we do. If this might even be, who knows, maybe your first time here. If not, you know what I'm going to say already, or something to the effect of what I'm going to say already. And that is to tell you a little bit about who the Alliance is and what we do. The Alliance was formed, about 6.5 years ago, really began with a personal experience, personal journey related to the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. That journey led down a interesting road where I began to understand the impact of a lot of punitive and exclusionary practices and discipline and outdated behavior management approaches, that were really having a poor effect on so many children and leading kids not only down to road of poor outcomes, but even down the school to prison pipeline. We're on a mission to really try to inform changes in policy and practice to reduce and eliminate things like restraint and seclusion and a lot of punitive exclusionary discipline, but also to head in better directions in terms of how to better support children in a school setting, teachers and staff and families and the community as well. I happen to be a big believer in the famous words of Maya Angelou, which is do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. That's what this work is all about. It's about, we know better now, and there's so many opportunities to do better. So I mentioned Alex, and we're going to get to introducing Alex here in just a moment. But before I do, a couple of quick housekeeping items. Again, if this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, good to have you here. I'm always excited to see how many people join us, every other week when we're doing these events. And I know many of you now by name, and some of you I've had the opportunity to meet as well. It's always such an honor that you spend some time with us and share your thoughts and your experiences with us as well. One of the things I always ask as we get ready to start a show is if you are watching live, and I know a number of you are now, if you are watching live, take a quick minute in the chat and let us know who you are and where you're from. I always tell our guests that we have people that join us from all over the world. So, while we're here in the United States, we have people from Canada and New Zealand and the UK and Australia and all over the world. So if you're joining us, let us know in the chat who you are and where you're from. One quick announcement that I wanted to make, we're getting here in the US to kind of a back to school time of year. Some of you have already been back to school for a while. My daughter just started this week. I know others that are starting in a week or two. It's a good time to continue, if you're an educator or a parent or, whoever you may be, continue your journey of learning. We have a professional development bundle that I've made available here on the Alliance e-learning platform that we have that is now featuring a couple of the events that we've done and at a really, really good price. It includes a training on the use of restraint and seclusion in North America schools. It also includes our Supporting All Brains conference we did earlier this year, which was a one-day conference kind of looking at neurodiversity and neuroscience-aligned approaches. And of course, we did an event back in May that was, I think, fantastic, but I'm a little biased, called Beyond Behaviorism. Really took a deep dive into understanding, a lot of the approaches that are taken around behavior and a lot of the behaviorism approaches that not only aren't working, but are failing a lot of our kids, and talking about alternatives. So this bundle, which is about $130 worth of training, we have on sale right now for $49. So recommend that. We have actually districts that have bought it for dozens of staff members, and if you're just an individual educator, you get it as well. It's a really good option. So with that, let's get to why we are really here today. And again, just one last reminder before we get started. Let me know in the chat who you are and where you're from, and glad to have you here. So let me go ahead and share the stage now with our special guest, Alex. It's great to see you here. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to be having today. I'm a big fan of your work and the things that you do, and the difference that you're making out there in education. So really excited to have you here. I'm going to share a short bio to tell people a little bit more about who you are. And of course, they're going to get an opportunity to learn quite a bit more through our conversation. Alex Venet is an educator, author, does a lot of professional development based in Vermont. And you teach graduate teacher education at Vermont State University. Previously, you were a teacher and leader at an alternative therapeutic school, community college instructor, after-school teacher in the upper elementary grades. You work with educators around the country, strengthening their trauma-informed education practices, and more importantly, aligning them with some things that are really important that we're going to talk about, with a focus on empowering teachers to create systemic change. And that's really important. I think anytime we can get individual educators feeling like they've got power to help influence change, good things can happen. You, of course, are the author of the best-selling book, Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education, which has been integrated into teacher education programs in several states, and has been cited in education research in more than 200 times. That's no small feat. And of course, you have a follow-up book, Becoming an Everyday Changemaker, Justice and Healing at School. Provides teachers with tools to implement trauma-informed practices starting wherever they might be, which is so important. It's one thing to have a lot of knowledge, but to be able to make it accessible and actionable is so important. I love that you focus on that. So, Alex, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here today.
I'm so excited to be here. It's a mutual admiration society. I am constantly sending people to your work. I feel like it is hard sometimes to find people who understand that trauma-informed education and sort of these classroom practices are actually a much larger political and social project. And so I am always connecting people with your work, which is so important.
I appreciate that, and it's always nice to find people on a like-minded journey who are, and I mean, likewise, we have featured a lot of your work on our social media and kind of sharing about the things that you're doing. I think it's really, really important. So really excited to have you here today. And our plan is really just to have a conversation today. I'm sure that we've got some people on that might be familiar with who you are and the work that you've done. We probably have some people that might be learning about you for the first time. So we're going to take a dive in and learn a little bit more about who you are and why you do what you do. But there's also several pieces of what you do that I really want to take a deeper dive in. So if you're ready, I'm ready. We can go ahead and get started here.
Let's do it.
All right, great. And again, feel free in the chat to let us know who you are and where you're from. I see that Chantel has just joined us. Chantel is actually our lead Canadian volunteer and signing on from British Columbia, Canada. So always good to have Chantel on here. So I want to talk a little bit about you. I mean, I gave a short bio, but I want to dive in deeper and understand what has led you down the road that you are down now. You do a lot of work, obviously, in education and supporting teachers both through university programming and other types of support in your books. But what kind of led you to this career, and more importantly, what led you to kind of some of the beliefs and values that you have in doing this work? So if we can go back in time a little bit, what kind of started you down this road?
Yeah. So I think in terms of the beliefs and the values, I think that a lot of different pieces of my, just my upbringing and the types of things I was interested in sort of primed me for the types of education values I have now. But it was sort of a happy accident in a way that I specifically got into this field. I ended up, after I graduated with my teaching license after college, I had been applying at all these public schools, but I had graduated into a recession. There weren't a lot of public school jobs, and I saw this job listed for an alternative school, and the job title was called counseling teacher. And it said, we want people from a teaching background or from a counseling background or an alternative education background like outdoor ed or whatever it may be. And this role is about teaching, but it's also about providing therapeutic support for our students who all have different needs around their social, emotional, and behavioral well-being. And I said, that sounds really cool. I want to check it out. And I ended up working there for a long time, and it really shaped a lot of what I did next. I think I was really lucky to have an experience. A lot of folks that I know have an experience kind of like you did, where you experienced the brokenness of the system first, and that spurred you to the actions that you do now. For me, I got lucky and started experiencing as an educator what a school can be like if it's based around trauma-informed principles, if it's based around unconditional positive regard for the students, if it's based around a philosophy that we're never going to restrain or seclude our students. That was a baseline at this school. And so I actually experienced sort of, it was far from perfect, but a lot of really beautiful things at this school. And so then I had the experience that when I started, mingling more with other educators through grad school or through conferences and hearing about what folks are doing in public schools and what they thought about what I was doing, I sort of went, wait a second, it's actually very weird what we're doing in this little pocket in my alternative school. And then I just became really excited about helping translate some of these practices going on in these little pockets and saying, how can we bring these out to the mainstream?
Mm.
And so then that really led me to all the very different things that I do now. But I always go back and draw on that experience of what does it feel like when actually all the pieces are in place and it's working really well.
Mm. And it sounds like you were very fortunate to kind of land where you landed initially. I mean,
So much.
a lot of the placements that kind of fall into that kind of alternative therapeutic setting placement. Unfortunately, many of those settings are far from therapeutic, and they're often
Yes,
very very driven by punitive and exclusionary practices. And I mean, it sounds like you were really fortunate to kind of get a start at a place that, um,
absolutely.
and I say this a lot, I think about, people ask questions like, well, gosh, why might a teacher, kind of lean into something like restraint or seclusion? And I think very often there's a couple reasons that this happens, but there are missing pieces in education. I'm sure we would both agree on, and one of those things is really how to support kids that are having a hard time or become dysregulated. And many times an educator might arrive for their first job without really having sufficient background and understanding and understanding of behavior. And if they happen to land at a place where these practices are common, it's kind of the first thing that's imprinted on you as an educator. Well, we don't like doing these things, but we have to do these things, and you kind of then begin to think that that's the way it has to be. You
Mhm.
of course had a very different experience, and it sounds like going to a place that they were doing so many things, and that's I mean, that's been a couple of years since you started in that role, and it sounds like a school that's probably far ahead of many of the you know places that fall under similar umbrellas today.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think you and I have talked about this before, but that school doesn't exist anymore.
Mm,
And as you well know, a lot of these programs that are kind of doing things in the way that is aligned to the values of, trauma informed, equity center, all these different pieces, these programs actually don't last very long
right.
because you see that the funding gets pulled. You see that there's all kinds of outside pressures on what's expected out of these programs. You see that the demands of working in these programs can actually be pretty high. And when the resources are low, you get turnover, right? There's so many factors, I think, that go into these types of programs not lasting very long.
Mm, mhm.
So it's very sad to me that that school actually isn't in operation anymore. And I think it really speaks to the need that, um, our work is so far from over, right? We
Mm,
have
mhm,
so
mhm.
much change to make, not only to bring these practices into all the public schools and everything, but also to really look at how do we support these programs to sustain that are really doing things right.
Yeah, yeah. No, no. You bring up a great point, and I have two different thoughts here. I mean, one, like you, it's like really frustrated that some of these places that have been successful don't exist anymore. The other side is, isn't it aspirational to think about the changes that we can make kind of going upstream so that some of these placements aren't necessary anymore? I think about the number of kids that end up in very restrictive settings that with the appropriate supports and accommodations and understanding could have been successful somewhere else. My son was one of those children that
Mhm,
absolutely he could have been successful with the right supports. So there's another part of me that wants to think of the aspirational end of like, what if we didn't need some of these things that
mhm.
we need? But it sure
Yeah.
is nice knowing that there are some that are really doing some great work, and I've seen it. I mean, I live in Maryland, and we actually, my son ended up in a non-public or a private school at the expense of our district after what we had gone through, and it was a real challenge finding one that wasn't going to be more likely to restrain and seclude him, or more
Mhm.
likely to do a lot of punitive, and exclusionary practices. But there certainly are some places out there. I want to dive back a little bit further. Just kind of curious. Anything in particular that led you down the road of education in the first place? Was there a teacher or an influence that that led you that? I think about, and I don't know. My daughter now is 16 and has some different ideas, but when she was very young, I remember her talking about how she wanted to be a special educator, and
Mm,
she saw some of the struggles that my son was going through, and kind of internalized that and thought, like, I want to do something to make a difference. But I know a lot of times it's a teacher or an experience, or sometimes families. I've known many families of educators. Was there anything in particular that led you down the road of education in
mm.
the first place?
I always was one of those kids. I loved school. I loved English class. I liked facilitating things whenever I would do clubs or whatever. So I really loved all of that. But I was thinking recently about an experience I had that I don't know if I've ever told this story on, in public before. So folks who are familiar with my work, this will be new to you, but and won't be a surprise at this younger version of me. So when I was probably in early high school or maybe even 8th grade, and at my Hebrew school, which is after school program at my synagogue, they were looking for someone to kind of be a classroom aide for a kid who had a disability where he needed a one-on-one with him, and even with the one-on-one was in sort of a separate classroom for the programming. And so I was there to help him out, help with some basic, just getting through the day type of stuff and help him with his lessons. And I have this distinct memory that there was one time where the kid had gotten very dysregulated, and I was there, trying to support, but I'm also a kid, right? I'm an 8th grade or 9th grade or something. So I'm doing my best to support, but he's pretty dysregulated. And I remember that the classroom teacher who was there to kind of be the special education teacher for, 4 or 5 kids, I remember her yelling at him. And I remember really strongly in that moment that I got very upset. And I then made a huge fuss about it to my parents and, kind of brought it up of like, hey, this isn't right. This kid is doing the best that he can. And of course he's getting dysregulated because that's part of, that we all get dysregulated. He's working on it. I'm here to try to help him. Why is she yelling at him and making things worse? And that memory just popped to me a couple weeks ago, and I was like, oh yeah, I see my villain origin story back then, that like I just have always been tuned in to these moments of injustice in the classroom, and of course that really sticks with me today. So I think it's just the way that I have always been tuned into things, and that's how I am today too, is to be really paying attention to what are these things that we all kind of take for granted, and how can we push back against them when they're not right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so important. I appreciate you sharing that story, and it really resonates with me for a couple of reasons. I one think about my son, who when he was young, I used to describe as having a very high justice drive. Like when things weren't fair or things didn't seem right, he would really have a hard time with that. And it one day occurred to me that I happened to share that with my son. Says the guy who quit his job of 20 some years after his son was, inappropriately restrained and secluded. Uh, but what I found is that it seems like a lot of the people that I'm working with in these spaces and collaborate with, who I would use the John Lewis words here and say are good troublemakers, are people that have that same characteristic. So I think sometimes we share that, but I think it's important because the world, and I don't think you'll disagree with me here, but the world needs good troublemakers now more than ever, and
Mhm.
I think it's important. I mean, and even as a child, I mean, I think able to kind of internalize that and have that thought. I mean, it's such a powerful thing to go through. So I appreciate you sharing that. So you go into education. Um, kind of have that initial experience, and that begins to kind of inform the things that you care about a lot. And of course, I want to talk about some of the work that you've been doing. Of course, you've written a couple of books now, and we'll talk a bit about those as well. Um, but I want to kind of dive into well, give me a second. I'm actually going to pull something up here, and just share. But just so there we go, we'll add that to the stage here. So you've written a couple of books now. One which was equity-centered trauma-informed education. Another one, Becoming an Everyday Changemaker. We talked about both of those already. But you really kind of began taking a deep dive into that equity-centered trauma-informed area. And of course, when it comes to the idea of trauma-informed practice, when it comes to the ideas of trauma-informed approaches in education, I think there's some really good news and there's some not so good news. The good news is that I think through a lot of hard work and a lot of advocacy, the idea of trauma, the idea of being trauma-informed, began to work its way into many settings, but education being one of those. So people were becoming more aware of trauma, more aware of the impact of trauma. Of course, none of this is brand new, though. I mean, the ACEs study was well over 20 years ago, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. But some of this was beginning to work its way into schools and other systems of care. And, people were beginning to take training in things like trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed education. And that, to those of us that might say, oh, well, that's can be really helpful, is a good thing. But then, of course, there's a point that something like trauma-informed can become a bit of a buzzword as well. And I've always kind of made this point that I'm a big supporter of kind of trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive approaches. But at the same time, you don't simply become trauma-informed because you went to a half-day PD and you learned about trauma. It is a journey. It is a path that I think requires a lot of work, a lot of dedication. But there's a lot of variation on this as well. And I mean, I've even found that you can head in a trauma-informed direction yet not be neurodiversity affirming, or you can head in a trauma-informed direction and be doing other things that can be harmful. So I'm sure that we both share this feeling that it's really important to understand the impact of trauma, how trauma changes the brain, what we can do differently, knowing about trauma, but also there's a challenge there as well. So we talk about here at the Alliance, we often talk about kind of what I call the 5 principles, but the idea of being trauma-informed, neuroscience aligned, neurodiversity affirming, relationship driven, collaborative, kind of all those pieces. But as you began to kind of really take a deep dive into the trauma informed area, you also begin to really anchor that with equity centered. So I wonder, with all that background to set it up, just to say like, hey, these things are really important, but just because you do a simple PD doesn't mean that you're there yet. It's a journey. So talk to me about your journey into kind of the trauma-informed space and how that led to that equity-centered alignment that you do so much work around.
Yeah. So, like I said, the school that I was at was sort of doing trauma informed before trauma informed was as big of a term as it is now. And we didn't always talk about it using that phrase. But then, like I said, as I went to grad school and started kind of mingling more in the broader education world, I started to recognize, oh yeah, that's the name for what we're doing. And so then I got really interested when I saw some books start popping up about trauma informed education. I saw these things. I said, oh, I want to see if this lines up with what we're doing. And so I started looking at them, and a couple of things stood out to me. One was that I started noticing that people were really talking about trauma as this thing that students were bringing with them into school. A lot of trauma informed folks actually use the phrase like the invisible backpack, right? Oh, they're bringing their trauma with them. But I started kind of feeling like, well, but the call is coming from inside the house, everybody, right? Like many of the students that we had in our school, of course, a lot of them had trauma that they had experienced at home or in the community, but very many of them had trauma they had experienced in their public school before they came to us. Many of our students had experiences with teachers, with other students, with the environment of schooling that was traumatic to them and was just as heavy on their mind and in their life as things they may have experienced outside of school. And so I started to really feel like, okay, we cannot let ourselves off the hook here. And furthermore, if we're only talking about stuff that's being brought in, it ends up creating this kind of icky savior mentality where we're rescuing kids from that horrible trauma out there, but our schools are magical and perfect. When, as folks who are watching this know, if you're connected to the Alliance of Seclusion and Against Seclusion and Restraint, you know schools are not magical and perfect, right? Lots of harm can happen in schools. And so I really wanted to center that in how I was talking about trauma. The other piece that I was really looking at is how many things I read and was studying about trauma didn't really make the connection between trauma and social identity. So I was reading these things about trauma that talked about kind of, here's the typical kid experiencing trauma, but they didn't mention that kid's race or gender or disability status or socioeconomic status or any of these things. And we know that those really impact our experiences of trauma, the resources available to us when we experience trauma and or try to get help. They experience how other people perceive whether we are struggling and need help or whether we are dangerous and need punishment. And so I really also wanted to ground this whole thing in equity of how can we make sure we're not missing those pieces. And so when I put it all together into my book and into my, frameworks that I have in there, a couple of things that were important to me. One was to highlight that inequity causes trauma. So not only that all of those different pieces of social identity and the isms and all of that can cause trauma to a person, but also the inequities that we see in school around funding and who has a school counselor and who has a school nurse, and all of those things can lead to students' experience of stress and trauma. But then also, once you experience trauma, school is not equitable for you, right? We know that kids who experience trauma are often subject to harsher discipline, harsher punishments in school. We know their learning needs are not met. And so I really wanted to look at that two-way connection. And then I articulated, as you've pulled up here, these principles that can really help us ground our trauma-informed practices and make sure that they take into account both of those directions of connection between equity and trauma. So you'll see on here that anti-racist, anti-oppression is the very first thing, right? If racism and oppression and ableism and all the things cause trauma, then we need to work against those as a core part of our work. We're not going to have like a savory, whitewashed version of trauma-informed. You have asset-based. That's really the idea of being strengths-based, that people have their own self-determination, they have their own wants and needs and hopes and dreams, and that we are never using power over and trying to control people and where they go. You have systems oriented. So again, recognizing that this is not the responsibility of individual teachers alone or individual parents or whoever. It's systemic change that is needed. So we're not just going to talk about classroom practice. We're also going to talk about policy. The human-centered piece is that we're not reducing people to numbers. We're not even an ACEs score. I actually am not a huge fan of the ACEs score. I could rant about that separately. But we're not reducing people to numbers. We're not reducing people to cogs in a system. We're always coming back to their humanity. Universal and proactive is that we're not waiting until people experience trauma to then give them trauma-informed practice, but that everybody gets it all the time. I sometimes say it's like that Oprah, like, you get a car, you get a car, you get trauma-informed, you get trauma-informed. Everybody gets it. And then the last one there is social justice focused, which is basically the idea that trauma-informed practice is interconnected to all of our other social justice work that we're doing. It's connected to anti-racism, anti-ableism. It's connected to all the things that we're doing. It's not a separate carve out. And by that, in a lot of ways, I really mean that trauma-informed education is political, and we shouldn't pretend that it's not. It really has to be connected to all these systems of power. So yeah, that's the gist of it.
And of course, you wrote a book that we talked about a moment ago about all of this. So whether your book or whether having a conversation with an educator, what are your recommendations? I mean, for someone who recognizes the need, and you talked about, and this is something I think is so critical. You talked about kind of this idea of trauma and systems of care or systemic trauma. That's something I've talked about quite a bit, is that there's often this idea that all the trauma is coming in, right? And there is a lot of trauma that come from within systems of care. And I think it's important that people understand that intent doesn't necessarily equate to impact. That sometimes, even
Mhm.
though you might have the right intent, that there's a lot of harm, and we see that through the work of the Alliance. We see a lot of harm that's done in systems of care, and that's not to be judgmental. It's just to understand that these are places that, when you have, especially you've been talking about young children who are put in the care of educators, and things happen to cause harm or lead to trauma, it really can be impactful. So I think that's a really important piece of this. But when you work with educators or you're working with students, kind of going down this road, how do you lead them in terms of beginning to think about and implement practices that align with this framework?
There are so many entry points, and one of the things that I say to educators pretty much every time I do a presentation or something is you can't do it all, but you can find a place to get started. Because if you really want to transform everything into equity centered, trauma informed, all these things, you really have to go down to the studs, right? You have to do a lot of self work around what am I bringing into this? What are my beliefs? How am I interacting with students? You have to look at the curriculum. What are the messages of the curriculum? How is it affirming or not affirming my students? How is it meeting all of the neurodiversity in my classroom? You have to look at the policy of the school. What are our lunch policies saying to kids? What are the late policies in the morning doing to our sense of inclusion? Then you have to look beyond, it keeps going up and up and up. And so there's so much. And so actually, I ended up writing a whole second book because I would get this question so often of, in the first book, I really talk about we have to change all the things. And I do give, I think, a lot of practical things in that first book where you could grab and get started. But I heard from so many teachers that said, I want to do it all. And I'm just one teacher, and folks in my school are not really on board. How the heck am I supposed to get started with this? And I got that question so many times that, as we writers do, I said, well, maybe I'll just write a little thing about it. And then it became a whole second book. And so that book really is about starting from wherever you are in whatever setting and whatever sphere of influence you have. How do you pick and choose the thing that you want to start with? And then how do you sustain that in the face of pushback, in the face of uncertainty on how to lead change? How do you really become that change maker, even if you don't feel like the leader that's going to speak from the, at the front of the auditorium, if you're not the person out on the side of the road with the sign, if you don't see yourself as that type of change maker, you still can be one. You still are one. So where do you begin? And so that book really goes into a ton of different practical tools, exercises on how to narrow it down, conversation prompts for you and your colleagues, so many different things.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it is a journey. But
Yes,
I happen to be a believer, and you can tell me I'm wrong if you want to. That's fine. I won't get my feelings hurt. But I do believe sometimes we all have more power than we think we have,
absolutely.
and it's not easy necessarily to take that leap or to take that step. But sometimes, I'm amazed by the people that I've known and that I've worked with and collaborated with, the things that they've been able to do or the changes they've been able to influence. And at the end of the day, um, sometimes scale is less important than the fact that you're doing something, right? So,
Yes.
maybe you can't change the whole school. Maybe that's true, but maybe you can change it for your class. Maybe it's a student. Maybe you can make a change that really, and to me, all of those differences, all of those changes are changes worth making, and the impact you can have can be so significant.
Yes, I wanna read you a quote that I actually include in my second book. I think I quote it 3 different times because it's just that good. It's from a teacher named Ursula Wolf-Rocca, who's out in the Pacific Northwest. She posted this to Twitter back in the day, and I think about it pretty much every day because it's that good. Here's what she said: "It can be overwhelming to witness, experience, and take in all the injustices of the moment. The good news is that they're all connected. So if your little corner of work involves pulling at one of the threads, you're helping to unravel the whole damn cloth."
Mm, mhm.
So
Uh,
it's
yeah,
just what you said, right?
right, right,
Everything is connected.
right.
What I do in my classroom is connected to the big policy, is connected to people working on a totally different issue because it's all part of the same big structure of injustice. And so I totally agree with you that we can find really small ways to get started. And I think what then happens is that people experience that feeling of, oh, I could do that. Let me try the next thing. And I'll actually share for folks, if anyone is listening and kind of thinking, well, where could I get started with something before I get your whole book, Alex? um, I'll give you an activity I have my grad students do in a class that I teach once a year called Radically Rethinking Classroom Management. Very of interest to folks connected to the Alliance here. In that class, we read the amazing book Troublemakers by Carla Shalaby. And in that book, she talks a lot about the idea that we want to foster freedom among our students and that schools often infringe on students' freedom rather than foster it. And so one of the things I have my students do in that class is I say, you're going to do a freedom experiment. For 2 weeks, I want you to pick something in your classroom that you kind of have some control stuff about. And I want you to just try for 2 weeks easing the control from you to your students and see how it goes. I say to them at the start, it might go horribly. It might be a mess. The point is not for it to be perfect, but I want you to just feel what it feels like to let go of some control and give it to your students. And so some of the teachers with this, they've tried it in all different ways. I've had some teachers do, they stopped assigning seating or they let students pick their seats for 2 weeks. I have had some teachers try different things around, the lunch structure. I've had teachers try things about they had been, really specific with, nitpicking a lot of little low level behavior. And for 2 weeks, they just said, you know what? I'm going to stop addressing that like tiny behavior from the same two kids. And instead, I'm going to ask those two kids what we should do about this problem, right? And in almost every situation, what the teachers found after those 2 weeks was, it didn't always go perfectly. It often was messy, but they said, this is doable. And my students liked having some more freedom, and I didn't mind letting go, and I see the benefit of it. And so it can be that small that you just pick a short amount of time and one tiny little thing and just try it and then see what momentum that gives you.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I mean, just a very simple lesson in kind of power with instead of power over,
Yes.
changing dynamics, a big big, fan of kind of working with and collaborating with kids rather than just doing things to them all the time, which is so often how so many of these, approaches are just kind of rooted. Yeah, big changes can come sometimes from small things.
Mhm.
And I think your other point is important. Again, on a journey, give yourself grace. Like this is a learning practice, and sometimes getting outside of your comfort zone and trying something that's rooted in the right principles can really make a positive difference.
Mhm. And as you were saying before, sometimes teachers end up in the first school they work in an environment where they're expected to use punitive and controlling
Mm,
behaviors to manage their students. And so having these little experiments or just trying out something, it can actually feel really scary because you go, okay, well, what if I let it be a little loud and messy in my classroom, but then my principal walks by and he's worried that I have lost all control or I'm supposed to, really manage and monitor when my kids go to the bathroom. And so I'm going to get in trouble if I stop making them, only sign out 2 times a quarter or whatever it is. And so I think that one other thing that those little experiments can do is test your own tolerance for that troublemaking, right? Like what tolerance do I have to take a little risk? What's going to happen if I do that? A lot of times folks find it actually is all right. I could do it, or this is important enough to me that I'm going to take that risk
mm,
because these practices we're talking about, like I said, they're political in the sense that they go against the mainstream American culture of control and punishment. And so
mhm, mhm,
it is risky to
mhm,
use alternative practices.
mhm.
And I think that we need to be brave enough in these times to say that risk matters and my students deserve it. And so I'm going to find what level of that I can safely take on and make some change.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I love the quote you shared. So I'm gonna have to grab that from you later. That's something that, as you were saying that, and somebody else I think left a comment as you were kind of reading that quote. So powerful. But I mean, talk about a moment in time where something like that's really meaningful.
Mhm.
It's easy for us in our lives, in our careers, wherever we may be, to feel overwhelmed and feel like we can't do anything. But again, you begin in a small corner. We can all have an impact in unraveling things and making change. So that's a really good point to take us in a slightly different direction. But before I do, I see a question here from Chantel. And Chantel's asking if there's a concise resource that I could point the child and youth advocate and premier of New Brunswick, kind of politically oriented positions, in to my advocacy work to convey the idea that all systems need to be rooted in this type of framework. So, thinking about the everyday change makers, are there resources that you recommend them to use to bring others along? So, are there things that you found have been really helpful to share with somebody, whether it's a school or whether it's somebody political that you might be trying to bring along into a different direction?
It's a great question because on the one hand, my mind goes, okay, well, I think I make the case really well in equity centered trauma informed education. So, not to toot my own horn, but there's some great excerpts from there you could pull out. And you could also look at, the folks that I cite in there and pull some of those resources. But the other thing that comes to mind when I hear questions like that is that folks who are really committed to the idea that trauma is an individual deficit and that our trauma informed work is about rescuing those poor kids over there and all these
Mm,
things.
mm, mm.
How do you get those folks to radically change their view of the world? Honestly, I don't really know. I think that sometimes that change can happen, but lately in these times, I've been spending more of my energy really building up those folks who are kind of already on my team and who maybe are curious or hesitant or worried, but really want to take action. I know that there are other people that really do great work about how do you change folks' minds across difference. For me to go to that quote I read, that's not the thread I'm pulling on. And so I would take a look around and see, what are some strategies for really reaching across to change the whole worldview. Like I said, I do think my work has some good resources to pass along, but I also think it's okay sometimes to go, why don't I try to build some folks up rather than try to tear down somebody's worldview that I'm not quite sure if they're going to shift. I
Yeah,
don't know if
yeah,
that's too
yeah,
pessimistic an
yeah,
answer, but
yeah.
that's
Well,
that's my real answer.
no, I think it's a good answer, and I think the first part of that answer, I mean, a very simple thing to do is give them a copy of Equity Center Trauma Informed Education. Like, if you have someone in a position that really is genuinely interested in making an investment, there's no easy resource to say, okay, let me have 20 seconds to change somebody's mind. That's just not reality. But if you have somebody that's genuinely interested, and through our advocacy work, through sharing our stories, through sharing our narratives, sometimes we can spark that genuine interest. I think the other important part of it is always to listen. I'll listen for a while before I speak in many cases, just because if somebody has a different opinion, I want to hear kind of where they're coming from, and have an opportunity to kind of latch into some of the things that they might have shared in a way that might be meaningful to them. So, Chantel, I think a good short answer is get them a copy of that book, and there's some resources within that as well that might be helpful. But I want to transition a little bit. You mentioned a couple things. And some of my least favorite words, like things like compliance and control, and you mentioned managing behavior, and I always hate the idea of like managing someone else's behavior, and that gets us into the realm of still what is very common practice today in a lot of our schools: behaviorism. A lot of operant conditioning, reward and consequence models, a lot of things that are done to kids rather than collaborating with them, and of course, we see that in the form of a lot of practices that, in my opinion, and I'm really curious about yours because I know what I think, but in my opinion, aren't necessarily aligned with trauma informed and equity driven mindsets and shifts. So I'm just kind of curious, your thoughts on a lot of the things that are being done to manage behavior or control behavior. And not only do we have a lot of punitive and exclusionary discipline, but we have a lot of compliance based approaches. And in my mind, while um, not to say that there's never a situation where you may not be able to get some immediate result from something that you do in that vein. Very rarely are you going to get the kind of lasting growth that you need to help support someone. So,
Mhm.
any thought kind of broadly, and I'll just give you the highlight of where I'm headed with this because I think you probably know. I'm going to head into PBIS here in a minute, but just kind of curious at the higher level of behaviorism and compliance-based approaches, how that interacts with your thinking, your teaching, your writing around kind of trauma-informed and equity-driven approaches.
Yeah. I think that compliance and trauma-informed education, they can't live near each other at all.
Right.
And sometimes when we talk about this, people go, "Well, but you need safety in trauma-informed education, and so don't you sometimes need compliance for that?" And yeah, sure, you need folks to follow directions sometimes to have safety, but that's not really what we're talking about in schools. In schools, there's this much larger culture of that power over framework
Yep.
you mentioned, that the adults have power over the kids, the system has power over the teachers, right? And that from the top down, everyone is basically trying to make everyone else do the expected behavior, and fall in line with things. And of course, that's a harsh way to describe it. And I think a lot of folks will go, "Well, I don't really do it that way in my classroom." But you would be surprised, I think, when you start to get into looking at the ways compliance shows up, the ways behaviorism shows up, it can often be very subtle things that we don't even really recognize that we're doing. From reminding kids to sit in a certain way to even the idea of lining up in a straight line to go down the hallway. That's one of those practices where if you really stop and think about it, why do the kids have to go in a single
Right.
file line
Right.
down the
Right.
hallway? Like, really, why, right? If your hallway is genuinely so narrow and there's so many people in all the time that they can only walk in a single file line, maybe, okay? But in most schools, that's not the case, right? What is the true harm in kids walking in a clump or two by two or whatever it may be? When you really start to dig in and question, the response that you end up digging to is, well, because it's easier for me to control everything if I do that. And, I'm always on a teacher's side, and so I know that it's hard because you have to do a lot in a day, and there are some things that genuinely, if this thing can just be easier, then I get it. But every single thing that some kids go through in a day, if every single choice is about it being, easier to control, easier to manage, predictable, all these things, that feels bad, right? I
Right.
often invite adults to think about when you go to the airport, how do you feel in your spirit when you go to the airport and you don't have control over where you walk or what you do, or even like sometimes what you talk about, right? Because you're worried about who's going to overhear you and take your joke the wrong way, or can I leave my things here while I go to the bathroom, right? That feeling doesn't feel good, and I think that's what a lot of kids experience in school. So how can I make my school not feel like an airport is a great question to get us started on how do I let go of some compliance. And the shift that I
That sounds
often
like another book title.
yeah, maybe that's my next one. But the shift here really, right, is that a lot of folks talk about, not just me, right, is how do I focus on community rather than compliance?
Mm,
So
mhm,
that's
mhm.
the very big picture to me.
Yeah, no, no, no. I love that, and I think it's important. But there is a heavy focus on compliance, and I think something that you and I both know probably all too well is that many a child who's been restrained or secluded or had other things done to them in the name of their behavior. Many of these things began with a demand for compliance, right? A kid who was already having a difficult time, who as they're perhaps having some behavior, maybe stress related behaviors, they're having behavior. The first thing that happens is they're met with demands for compliance, and a nervous system that's already going offline, feeling dysregulated. As we begin to pile more and more demands on an individual, it doesn't usually push them in a better direction. So we see a lot of harm kind of done in the name of compliance. And you bring up a really good point, and this is so important. Sometimes it's a power struggle, right? The power struggle with a kid. How often does that power struggle lead to something really bad? And there are times that it doesn't need to be a power struggle. There are
Mhm.
times that, because I said so, maybe we need to rethink what we're asking of someone if it's not absolutely necessary in that moment in time. And there's a time for us to take a step back. But I mean, I get the pressures that are there, but
Mhm.
at the same time, does this have to be a hill right now that you know
Yes, and one of the things that I talk about a lot, and I talk about in Becoming an Everyday Changemaker is the importance of a both and mindset.
Mm,
The idea that our systems often try to push us into these binary choices, either this or that. For example, either compliance or chaos, right? If you don't get the kids to comply, it's going to be unsafe, it's going to be chaos. But a both and mindset allows us to take two truths that seem like they conflict and hold them together and experience the frustration or the tension that comes out of that, but to really work through that and go, what happens when both of these things are present? What happens when sometimes we need compliance for safety and at the same time we need freedom?
right.
How do I manage those two things together? What possibilities come out of holding those two things together? What questions do I have when I try to hold those two things together? And so in that book, I have a couple exercises there for sort of holding both and really working through that to find what's going to work. Because
Mm,
of course, if you're in a school or a situation where compliance has been taught to you and is really big, I'm not suggesting that all of a sudden you have no rules and no
right. Of course. Of
expectation,
course. Of
because
course.
that's not safe. It
Yep.
doesn't feel good to
That's
anybody
right.
either,
That's right.
right? It
Yeah.
shouldn't be a free for all. But that's again where I go to, what could you experiment with for 2 weeks? What are
Right.
some small places where you can let go? And then over time we make the big shift.
Yeah, yeah, love it, love it. What you just mentioned kind of reminded me of an article that you wrote a couple of years ago that I have shared many a times. Shared many a times because the question has been posed to me many a times, which is, what about the other kids in the room? And this article kind of goes into, a big behavior that might happen, and the question that sometimes comes, which is, well, what about all the other kids? It's not fair to them, or it might be stressful to them. Can you talk to me a little bit about this article and kind of where you were headed with this? Because again, when it comes to issues that we focus on here at the Alliance, this is something you hear a lot. And your article actually outlined really well, where some of those responses might be coming from, which I think
Mhm.
is important to understand, but also kind of led into some areas of how you can think about this differently. So, would you
Mhm.
mind sharing a little bit about that? I know it's been a while, probably since you wrote
Yeah.
it, but such an important topic.
It's imprinted well because I still get this question constantly. So,
Mhm.
and if any of you here are watching that teach about any of these types of practices, you also get this question all the time. So,
Yep.
I had gotten this question a lot, and I was really thinking about how to write about it, how to respond to it, and where I start the article is really trying to think about, where is this question coming from for people? And I think it can come from a couple of places. One is a genuine sense of care, right? If your student or your group of students are there and one kid is getting very big dysregulated, right? If stuff is being broken, if stuff is being torn up, it's difficult, right? Just as a human, it is really difficult to watch somebody else struggle. And it distresses kids. It really does. And so I think there's a genuine sense of, how do we make sure that the whole classroom is not kind of catching the dysregulation? How are we not all feeling unsafe around this? I think that's a genuine question. But I also sometimes get this question where I hear a little bit of a challenge behind it, where folks are using this question to try to give themselves a reason to not use these progressive practices, to not try trauma informed or restorative practices. It's sort of saying, well, what about the other kids, as this way of saying, well, I don't really want to change my controlling behavior. I don't really want to stop using restraints. I don't really want to stop using seclusion. So I'm going to use these other kids as a reason to not do it. And so I tried to write my response kind of keeping in mind both of these things. And one of the big points that I make in here is to make a shift about the other kids from sort of these passive victims of dysregulation as equal members of community who are capable of caring about the person who's having a hard time. And I mention it at the end of this post, but I'm really influenced in my thinking here by Carla Shalaby, who I mentioned before. Again, her book Troublemakers is incredible. If you haven't read it yet, if you're watching this, I already know you're going to love it. So please get it. But one of the, when we shift that mindset to say these kids are all members of a community, you shift from the idea that the one kid having a hard time is an outlier who needs to be removed for the community to function. you shift from that to going, this is a whole community challenge. So how do we embrace it as a whole community? How can the other kids show up for the kid who's having a hard time? How can they be invited to support the kid who's having a hard time? How can they process and make sense of what's happening? Too often, when kids are pulled out of the room, the other kids are not given the basic respect of talking about it at all, right?
Right.
We sort of pretend that nothing happened, which is like, what are you talking about? Like, they saw everything go down, right? They want to process it. We can actively help them to feel safe. We can do things that invite them into understanding that there's a range of human behavior and ways of responding to stress, right? And I think about that now, right? Again, going back to the airport, right? How many times have we seen these like viral videos of people having a meltdown in the airport? And when I see those, I always wonder, right? Like, what would be different in our society if instead of filming them, we helped them, right? Like we saw this as a community thing to take care of. And then one other point I think is really important there, you have at the bottom of the screen there, is that the other kids are not necessarily other kids, right? They are watching for how you respond to the kid who's having a hard time. And one of the things they learn from that is whether they are allowed to have a hard time, right? You have kids who, through their childhood, will never tell anybody that they have been abused, will never tell anybody that they are depressed or struggling. And part of the reason that kids don't tell adults about that is because they're worried about the response, right? Am I going to be treated in a way that makes things worse? And so if we are responding to the one kid with the big outward dysregulation by pulling them out of the classroom, not talking about it, or talking about it in condescending and exclusionary ways, right? All the other kids are paying attention and
Right.
they're learning, I'm not allowed to have a hard day. I'm not allowed to struggle because that's going to happen to me. I'm going to be made into, that one kid that we all kind of feel weird about if I have a hard time. And so when we really focus on inclusion and community with the one kid who's struggling, it's benefiting every single kid who's watching.
Yeah. Well, I also think about, what we know, and what we know are the kids that might be the kids that are struggling, the kids that might be, getting restrained or secluded or having something else done to them. More often children with disabilities, more often
Mhm,
Black and brown kids, more often kids that already have a trauma history. What's the message being sent there as well? I think about some of the specialized environments that we talked about earlier, and sometimes, you know, imagine again being in this setting, and the stress and anxiety of wondering if this is going to be happening to you next. But even the larger, what does this say when it's the 8-year-old Black autistic child who is every day having this done to them? I think it's really concerning
mhm,
about the impact that it can have. And you did a really, I think, a very thoughtful job in this article, and I've shared it many times because I've heard that question many times, and I agree with you. There, there are times that these questions come from a very sincere, place of kind of questioning and wondering, and other times it becomes I've tried everything. I know everything. Then somebody's not open to the possibility that there could be something different that they could do. And it's just well, what about the other kids?
mhm,
So I've heard both sides of that. And I've had discussions with people that have been on both sides of that. But I think you did a really great job of addressing it here. I want to pause for a minute, and just as we're kind of moving through things, invite people, if you're watching live, if you have any questions or comments, I would encourage you to put those in the chat. We have probably about 15 minutes or so, and we're getting ready to dive into another topic here. But
hmm,
if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat now, and we'll try to get to a couple of them. So the other place I wanted to go with you is, we've talked a little bit about kind of your work at a high level. We've talked about your own journey, and it's interesting because that article, having had you share your story earlier today, I kind of saw you in that article too, when you're talking
mhm,
about how, the other kids having an opportunity to kind of help and support. So, it's interesting. There's a little bit of a full circle moment there as I was, thinking about your article and processing the story that you shared today. But we've covered a lot of ground. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, we've hit a little bit on behaviorism. But you've done a lot around PBIS. We have at the Alliance a lot of concerns around PBIS. I used to joke that, positive behavior interventions and supports, it sounds like a really positive thing, like a basket full of puppies. But the truth of the matter is, we know that a lot of the approaches being taken under that PBIS umbrella are very entrenched in a lot of behaviorism, a lot of reward, kind of consequence, mindsets, and and not to say that there aren't, somewhere in some of that, some ideas that are, worthy of consideration, but by and large, the way that we often see it implemented, not only is it not working for kids that need help, it's often the thing that's leading kids to have a really difficult day or a meltdown or whatever it may be. So we're not big fans here at the Alliance when it comes to PBIS. But you actually have not only published an article that in a peer-reviewed journal about PBIS and as it relates to trauma-informed education. You've got some great resources as well. I'm going to pull up this journal article that you co-wrote here, and I wonder if you might talk a little bit about it. The article, of course, was called "Unsnarling PBIS and Trauma-Informed Education." Could you tell us a little bit about this article? What you found, and what it was all about.
Yeah. So, I sometimes call myself a professional PBIS hater. I actually haven't worked in a school with PBIS, but when I started to go out and train schools on trauma-informed practices and work with teachers all over, I kept getting this thing of, oh, well, we really want to integrate this with our PBIS implementation. We really want to make sure that this melds beautifully with our PBIS. And so I got really interested and started looking a lot more into PBIS. And as I said before, coming from sort of outside this mainstream, I like to critique a lot of things that are in the mainstream. And the further I dug into it, the more I didn't like it. And then having had many, many, many conversations with educators who are using PBIS or forced to use PBIS, I have only become have more conviction now.
Mm.
And so this article I co-wrote with my friend and colleague, Rhiannon Kim, who is brilliant and working on a book that also will be brilliant. And it was for a special issue of a journal article, really looking at making sure that trauma-informed practices stay in this systemic equity-centered rooting. And so we focused on this question of, can PBIS and trauma-informed practices coexist? And we really argue firmly that they cannot. I would say the quickest way I can summarize it, but we go very deep in the weeds in the whole article, is that if you look at the roots of trauma-informed practice, you'll see that trauma-informed practice was developed by survivors of trauma who wanted to advocate for themselves and to transform their environments so that their needs were better met. If you look at the roots of behaviorism, which, by the way, I'll put a huge plug for the Alliance's Beyond Behaviorism content that Guy mentioned earlier. I attended that. I know you can watch the replay, but I learned so much more about the roots of behaviorism than I had even already known. But the roots of behaviorism are around, clinicians using power over folks, largely folks with disabilities and neurodivergent folks, trying to change and control their behavior and bring the tools of institutionalization into the rest of their lives. Behaviorism has such problematic and, I would say, borderline evil history. And PBIS comes straight out of the lineage of behaviorism. And so even if you are doing a kind and friendly version of PBIS, even if you are not really doing the point system and all these things, I just feel that you cannot ignore the lineage of that approach. And that lineage clashes so deeply with the lineage of trauma-informed practices. When people go, oh, but I like these parts of PBIS. I like that we have common language. I like that we look for the good. Great. You don't actually need PBIS to do
Right,
those things,
exactly,
right? Like,
exactly.
you don't need it. You don't need to do the whole points. You don't need to do, I had to call them like tiger bucks, right? Like
Right.
you don't need to do the whole reward system, all that stuff. And so the link that I know is being shared around, I have a resource roundup on my website I call it problematizing PBIS Roundup. And the goal I have there is to just provide you with a bunch of counterpoints to PBIS to help you come to your own decision about what you think about it, to help you put some language. Often teachers will go, I kind of feel weird about PBIS, but I don't really know how to explain why. I have 15 or so links here, podcasts, articles, academic research, all these different things. So you can come in at whatever point is accessible to you and really develop your understanding. A big reason why I felt inspired to put this together is that PBIS is a really big institution in our country. There's a lot of money behind it.
Yep. Yep.
And criticism of PBIS often gets really shut down, and people are afraid to criticize PBIS, which is really strange. And so I want to make these types of resources really easily available to folks. So highly encourage people that if you're one of those folks, I feel weird and I don't know how to put words to it, go explore this list. And I know AASR has a bunch of stuff on their website as well.
Yeah, yeah. I remember a couple of years ago being at the Department of Education, meeting with some folks, and it happened to be a day or two after we had published an article about the problem with behaviorism that went into PBIS. And, some of the folks there weren't too excited about the article, but, we, of course, felt very strongly about it. And, I've over the years had many people that have tried to shift my view around PBIS, but, like you said, at its roots, it's behaviorism. And,
Yeah.
I often hear these things about, oh, well, we don't do this or we don't do that. So much of what's being done is ineffective for kids that need help, that need connection and support and compassion. And it is, it's in the same family, of course, as ABA, and we're not proponents of that either. And there's, a lot of, I think, harm that's done. And the truth of the matter is, and you probably share a similar experience, when you talk to people about it, yes, there's a lot of, oh, we're a PBIS school, but when you dig in and say, well, how's it working for you? It's not, right? So, why, other than there's been significant investment, and it's almost like, well, we put all the money into doing this, so we're going to do it, even though it may not be really leading to any significant change. So, but unfortunately, we often see this. We often see where, people continue to do the same things and expect different results. And, I'm worried about this moment in time that we're in, because I'm always concerned when I see things happening that might impact, people's rights and human rights and perspectives around, discipline. And, I'm sure you saw there was an executive order that went out at some point kind of talking about school discipline and the impact of that. We have boards of education talking about bringing back corporal punishment, or, kind of moving in very, very wrong directions. And, I think it's important to understand. And this is a great resource for people, that might be, kind of wondering, why not? And of course, I think you mentioned, here as well, kind of the what to do instead kind of idea, which is a common, you start to talk about these things, and it's not that there's okay, here's your in a box solution. To me, my what to do instead has become, trauma informed, neuroscience aligned, neurodiversity affirming, relationship driven, collaborative approaches. It's this, bigger framework of things that I think is really critical to shifting what we're doing. It's moving from, power over to power with. It's collaboration. It's understanding the power of relationships to heal. It's seeing human behavior through that lens of the brain and nervous system. To me, that was transformative. Really understanding human behavior differently. The fact that we reduce human behavior in behaviorism to kind of a matter of motive, a matter of, 4 basic functions of behavior, is not helping anyone, but it's,
Yes, and one of the things I say in training teachers about this is you can't skip over the mess of being a human, and you can't skip over the mess of community, right? It is inherently complicated and messy to be a person and to be a person in community with other people. And I think that the biggest lie of PBIS is that if we just do this with fidelity, then it's going to go over, it's going to make us skip all the mess. We won't have to deal with this pesky behavior challenge anymore, right? But it's not actually true, which people find out when they do it. And I really like in that academic article that Rhiannon Kim and I wrote, we cite a paper by Irene Yoon, who's a disability in education scholar, disability critical race theory and education scholar. And Irene Yoon writes in that, we talk about fidelity to PBIS, but what about our fidelity to the students,
Hmm.
right? Like our fidelity at the end of the day needs to be to the kids. And what does our practice look like if we lead with that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there are, pieces that you might resonate with people, but at the end of the day, again, if you're not able to put something in practice and make a positive difference for people, and to me, it's the why beneath something. What are you trying to accomplish? I mean, that's been for a long time. One of the problems that I had with ABA. If your goal is to take an autistic individual and make them less autistic, then that's not the right goal. I think about the data collection aspect of things like PBIS, and I can tell you from firsthand knowledge of my son being chased around with a clicker, that being chased around with a clicker to collect data points is not in any way helpful to him. He
Mhm.
came to the realization at one point of what they were doing and said, "Hey, do you ever make a mark when I do something right?" Imagine internalizing the way that we make people feel
Yeah.
through a lot of these programs. We have we have a really amazing group of volunteers that are part of our organization. We have a lot of educators and OTs and parents and self advocates. We recently we had an educator that was sharing some concern, but kind of somebody working in a school that was being forced to use some kind of token reward system, even though they shared with the school, like, I'm not comfortable doing this, and here's the reasons why I'm not comfortable doing this. But people get so bought into the system that they miss the big picture, and
Mhm.
it's really.
When I do my workshop about, moving away from these practices, I have a thing near the end where I say, okay, well, what if you're stuck in these systems? How can you kind of work within them? And one of my suggestions I have on that slide is universal basic tiger bucks, right? Like a riff off of universal basic income, where just give all the kids the same number of points every single week, no matter what, right? Like
Right,
just
right,
just disinvest from I'm going to give them out for all these little reasons and just hey, you get them just for being alive, right?
right,
So
right.
I also say when I talk about my PBIS hating ways that I don't like PBIS, but I'm always, like I said before, I'm always on the teacher's side, right? I'm
Right.
always here to support teachers. And so if you're in this system and you are required to use all these things, I get it. And there are certainly ways you can make trouble. And like we said,
Yep,
take
yep.
some of those risks to shift your practice, even if you're underneath that. And again, that resource list has a couple of those different, ways and strategies in there.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I'll definitely share that. Um, yeah, I like that idea. And we were kind of having a discussion, and like, well, what else could you do that if you had to do a system like that? And it's like, gosh, it's really hard because there was even a suggestion of like, oh, the kids could decide on their own things. I'm like, yeah, but they would internalize that. They would still feel the shame and
Mhm.
anxiety over that kind of compliance based system. So universal tiger bucks. I like that. Good take on it. Well, listen, we are about reaching the end of our time. Anybody in the chat, if you have any final thoughts or questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat. But I want to give you an opportunity as we're kind of wrapping up here. Any final thoughts you have, or anything inspirational you want to leave us with. These are tough times. These are tough times right now. It's a tough time in education. We're seeing it all over the country in so many areas. I mean, we I have a dream that you probably would share, and that is that you know I think that there's a lot of forces on teachers today, and not a lot of good forces on teachers. There's a lot of concerns that are coming from many different directions regarding mental health, politics, what they can do in their classroom, what they can't do in their classroom, whatever there's a lot of difficulty, and of course we're seeing less people now beginning to go into the profession, and we're seeing
Mm,
more loss of staff. I mean, in my mind, I think that teaching has the opportunity to be such a meaningful and joyful experience for educators. But there's a lot that's going against that right now. And I guess part of a question for you is, how do we get there? How do we get there to better support our teachers and educators, and make a difference to kind of bring some of the joy back to it, and to you know again, I think in doing that you benefit not only the children but the adults. Any thoughts?
Oh, any thoughts on how to solve the whole
The world's problems here.
Yeah. No, but I do actually. I think that our current moment is showing us what many folks have always known is true, which is that the solutions to all these complex problems are not floating down from above, right? The systems are not coming to rescue us, and we can't look there for the solutions. That means that all we have is each other, but that means that we have each other. And so the education system often works to divide and isolate educators, right? Go into your classroom here, you be on your own with the kids all day, and if you see somebody before you leave, well, that's a happy accident. One of the first things I want to encourage teachers these days is find your people, right?
Mhm.
Find that one person in the building who you're like, I think that maybe you're aligned with me. If you have no one in the building, find someone in the chat section of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live videos, right? Find somebody when you come to an event. Find somebody who's in a network, join up with national organizations. There's a
We've been
great,
doing book studies, and it's
yeah,
this
book studies.
amazing collaboration of people from across the world. I mean, we have people like in Japan and New Zealand that join the book studies, and you build this community.
Yes, yes, communities like that. I wanna shout out, especially today, there's an organization called Teachers Unify to End Gun Violence. They have
Mhm.
different national and local things. They have book studies as well, right? So whatever, wherever it is, find at least one person, get together with at least one person, because we know that relationships are everything in this work, and that's not just about the kids, that's about you. We're gonna go far
Yep.
if we go together, and so if you're feeling overwhelmed these days, that's my number one suggestion is find somebody who can be in this with you, and then, like I said earlier, you can't do everything, so where's that one small place that you can start, and ideally, where could you start together with at least one other person? And I think as frustrating and overwhelming as everything is, that's where we can begin is together.
Love it, love it. I want to share with everybody before you leave and we wrap up here. Of course, we've shared your website and people can go there and learn more about you. But tell us a little bit more about kind of the services you offer as well, because I know that you do some, professional development and courses and workshops. And we can of course point people to the website. But tell us a little bit more about some of the opportunities that people are interested in working with you.
Yeah, so I absolutely do workshops and keynotes and all that good stuff so folks can reach out. But for individual educators and caregivers, I especially want to shout out that I do a at least monthly pay what you can workshop on Zoom. I rotate through different topics. So, for example, I have one that's called Points, Prizes, and Tiger Bucks, Why They Don't Work and What You Can Do Instead. I have some on the 4 priorities of trauma-informed education. I have some on dysregulation. I'm skipping September, but I'll be back with those in October, and I typically will share those on my Instagram and my newsletter. And those are a really fun community that we have. It's pay what you can, including $0. I really try to make it accessible, and so I would love for folks to join me with that. And then the other thing I want to shout out is that for both of my books, if you're reading those with a group of people, even if it's just, two other people, if you have a book club, I will come to you for free for 30 minutes on Zoom or Google Meet or whatever, and do a Q&A with you after you finish reading. And you just have to email me to set that up. So again, just really want to try to make stuff accessible to folks. So please reach out.
Love it, love it. Yeah, and we're actually getting ready to put together our 2026 schedule for book studies, and I'd love to include one of your books in our book study. So I might be reaching out to you to see if you might
I'm
join us
there.
for that as well. One final question, I'm going to let you go. But I have to say something about this because I love unconditional learning. Um, I think we both probably are fans of Alfie Cohen, and I've always loved like unconditional parenting and this whole
Mhm.
idea that, kids need kind of that unconditional relationship and support. So just tell me a little bit of the backstory there. You don't have to go into the thing, but unconditional learning, why unconditional?
Yeah, so based around the idea of unconditional positive regard, which originally was developed Carl Rogers, and then, as you said, Alfie Kohn wrote this really impactful essay called "Unconditional Teaching," which I absolutely love. Unconditional positive regard was one of the things when I taught at that therapeutic school that was the driving force, and for me, it just absolutely changed the way that I approached working with kids. I created a definition of it, which is that when you have unconditional positive regard, you believe about your students this: I care about you, you have value, you don't have to do anything to prove it to me, and nothing is going to change my mind. And I really think that when we show up with that, everything changes, and I'm obsessed with it, and that's why I talk about it all the time. So if you also want to learn more about that, get in touch. I'd love to tell you more about it.
I love it. I love it. Alex, it's been such a pleasure to have you here again. Big fan of the work that you're doing, and I'm glad to know you're in the world doing what you're doing and making a difference. And of course, not only working with educators, but future educators and communities that you're supporting. So, thank you for making some time to talk to us today, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. It's like you said, it's good to have those relationships in that community, and for me, having a chance to chat with you and hearing about your work, it helps to counter some of that really overwhelming thing that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah.
So again, I just want to thank you, and I'm going to ask you to stick around for a second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else here, but if you can stick around, want to thank everybody for joining us today. And if you're not joining live, if you happen to be watching after the fact, great to have you here as well. I want to encourage you though, share these. We do these for a reason, and that is, by sharing stories and journeys, it can affect change, and it can help you understand who your community is, and feel empowered to do some things. And I think about your books, and of course, the whole idea of becoming an everyday change maker, I think is so critical. And we're in a world that needs it. We need change makers. We need people that provide unconditional support. So thank you, Alex, and we'll see everybody again next time.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, take care. All right, and just one second here. There we go.